Hey guys, so like everybody else on the planet, I'm self-isolated right now due to the coronavirus. I'm down in here in my workshop just screwing around making some hand-cut dovetail joint boxes for no particularly good reason. And I had occasion to pull out one of my woodworking tools off of my shelf over here. It's kind of interesting, so I thought I'd make a video explaining what it is and what it attempts to do. So for folks not really knowledgeable about woodworking in the past, basically prior to World War II, most homeowners did all of their woodworking by hand. The advent of home power tools really didn't happen until after the Second World War. The story that I've been told is that the factory workers who were building weapons of war during the war had access to industrial power tools and started sneaking them home so they could do things at home. And once the manufacturers started realizing that there was a market at home, they started making power tools for home, and the quality of hand tools declined after that. But prior to that, most homeowners had a stockpile of hand woodworking tools to get things done around the house. I've got a couple of them here. This is a miter box. Today we would use a powered miter box, a miter saw like that. But back in the day they would use a big monster like this with a big 30-inch blade. It's actually a very useful tool. An average homeowner would have something like this. This is a Stanley number 5. It's called a jack plane because it's a jack of all trades. Basically, it's used for straightening and smoothing wood. And then there were a bunch of different hand planes on the market. The largest manufacturer of hand planes in the United States back then was Stanley. It's the same Stanley that sells tools and all sorts of hardware today. But they sold a myriad of different woodworking tools, particularly hand planes. I've got a couple here. This is a Stanley number 79. This basically allows you to widen a groove. Like if you cut a groove in a piece of wood, you need a little bit wider. This plane rides in the groove and will make it wider. I've got another one here. This is a Stanley number 48. You see that? This is a tongue and groove plane. If you have boards that you want to make tongue and groove, so one edge has a tongue and one edge has a groove and they mate together, you can use this one plane to do both things. But prior to the advent of metal woodworking tools, we're talking maybe like 1870, 1880, before these kinds of tools came out, woodworking planes were made out of wood. So we have one here. This is about 1850. This is a beading plane, so you can see it's entirely made out of wood, the body of it, and it has a metal blade right there, and it cuts a bead on the edge of a board. So a home woodworker back, let's say 1850, 1860, 1870, something like that, would a professional or a home woodworker would have shelves full of these types of planes, because each plane can only do one job. So you would need a myriad of different planes to make a piece of furniture or to be a professional woodworker. So Stanley came along and said, well, geez, is it possible for us to design a single plane that would take the place of a whole shelf full of these? And Stanley was pretty shameless in their marketing and their engineering. They would produce planes for all sorts of different tasks, and some of them were really kind of dubious in terms of quality or capability of doing a job. But they did introduce a plane that attempted to take the place of a whole shelf full of these. They actually made two. One's called the Stanley number 45 and one's called the Stanley number 55. And I have a vintage Stanley 45, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. So what I have here is a Stanley number 45 combination plane. Can you see that? 45? This was one of two attempts by Stanley to make a plane that could do a multitude of different tasks. One single plane to do 200 different cuts, that kind of thing. They also made one called the Stanley number 55, which is an even more complicated looking beast than this one is. This is definitely some impressive Victorian engineering here. So this plane right now is set up to cut a groove, which is a flat bottom channel going with the grain in a piece of wood. And let me show you how all the different pieces and parts of this go together. Looks like a beast, but it actually works pretty well for certain things. So right now I've got three main pieces of the plane together. First one here is the fence. Rosewood handle, rosewood skate. And it attaches to these two rods here. We'll talk more about those in a minute. The second piece is the secondary skate. You can see here it's got a handle built in, and it's got place to secure the two rods, to secure it to the main body of the plane. Okay. Also on this side, you see that right there? That's called a nicker. That is for cutting the fibers of the wood if you're cutting across the grain. We'll talk more about that in a minute too. Here's the main body of the plane. You can see there's a whole bunch of different adjustments on this. Don't be scared, it's not that bad. So we have, again, the two rods for connecting the other two parts of the plane to the main body. Here we have a depth adjustment. So you loosen this screw, and then you twist this nut, and this lowers and raises the skate, and that will set the depth of your cut. Okay. Here we have the adjustment for setting the depth of the blade itself. So what we do is we loosen this wing nut, and that loosens the blade, which is over here. And by loosening this wing nut and giving it a whack, it allows us to raise and lower the blade using this dial here, this little nut here. Okay. And then when we're done, we tighten that wing nut. Over here, we have a place to put a second depth adjuster. I'm not quite sure why you'd use two. I suppose if your plane was rocking back and forth, you could use the second one. But you also have the ability to put a longer depth adjustment here. Okay. So some other accessories that came with the plane originally. This one in particular, I've dated it to about 1904. So originally would have come with this. This is the selection of blades that it came with. You can see we've got blades here for cutting grooves and dados. A dado is a flat bottom channel cut across the grain of the wood. And we also have some blades for doing beading. You'll see it like that. For making different beads in a whole bunch of different sizes. Okay. And it also came with some specialty blades. So here we have a blade, came for cutting a groove if you're making tongue and groove boards. See that? And here we have an unusual blade. This is made for cutting the mullions, which are the little separators that go between panes of glass in a window. I actually have some windows in my house that were apparently made by a homeowner about 80, 90 years ago that matched this profile. So he may have actually made those windows with one of these combination planes. It's kind of cool. So the way all of this works is you decide what kind of cut you're going to make. In this case, we have a 1/4 inch blade in here, and we're going to make it a groove cut, a kind of flat bottom channel in a piece of wood. Now, depending on how wide your blade is, you're going to set this secondary skate to the width of your blade. So in this case, as you can see there, the two skates together are roughly the same width as the blade. If we were using a wider blade, we would set the skate farther apart so that each edge of the blade was supported by one of these skates. So if the blade, for example, was this wide, we would set the skates farther apart to be slightly less than the width of the blade. Okay. Then when we've got the skate where we want it, we tighten up these two thumb screws here. Okay. Now, if we're cutting a groove at some distance from the edge of a board, we then use this fence, and we attach the fence to the rods and then tighten it up with these thumb screws. And now we've got our plane set up so it's going to cut a 1/4 inch groove at a distance from the edge of the board. Let me put this skip back. So now we've got our blade set up to cut a 1/4 inch groove at this depth, this far away from the edge of the board. If you needed to make a groove or a cut of some sort at a great distance from the edge of a board, the plane came with this extra long set of rods. As you can see here, I've got the fence set a good 6 inches away from the blade. And the problem with that is that great distance is sometimes the plane would want to rock back and forth. So what they also included is this. Can you see that? This is a cam. And there's a screw on the cam, which I don't have right now, but it would allow you to set, see that? It will allow you to act as like a crutch on the middle of the board to keep the plane from rocking back and forth. And because it's a cam, see, you can set it to almost any depth. Just set it for whatever depth you needed and tighten the screw, and it would hold the keep the plane from rocking back and forth. So with the plane, you receive this initial set of blades. These are, again, the flat blades for cutting dados and grooves, and the beading blades here for cutting beads on the edges of boards and things for decorative beads. There are also other packs of blades that you could buy from Stanley. They would cut things like hollows and rounds, meaning convex and concave channels, and all sorts of things like that. But the reality of the situation is that the Stanley 45 really sucks at cutting most of these things. I'll explain why here. So if we look at this wood plane, can you see the blade there? And can you see the bottom of the plane here? How the profile of the bottom of the plane matches the shape of the blade? That provides support and helps to promote a nice clean cut. The problem is Stanley is that you don't have that with these blades. All you have are these two thin skates. So if you're cutting unusual shapes, beads, hollows, rounds, things like that, and you don't have the area in front and behind the blade being the same shape, what ends up happening is you get really lousy looking cuts, really ripped out and things like that, unless you're really lucky. So the 45, aside from cutting things like grooves, the 45 is not the ideal tool for cutting other kinds of shapes and things like that. So having said that, why don't we try cutting a groove on a board with this so I can show you how it works. Alright, so what I have here is my Stanley number 45 with a 1/4 inch bit in it, or a 1/4 inch blade in it, to cut a 1/4 inch wide groove. I've got a scrap piece of pine here, and I'm definitely cutting with the grain, because the grain goes this way. You cut with the grain. If you try to cut against the grain, bad things happen, especially with a 45 plane. So what we want to do is take nice thin cuts. We don't want to take too strong of a cut, because that will promote tear out and bad things will happen. So what we'll do is we'll start at one end and we'll work our way backwards, and eventually we'll make the whole groove. There. Did you hear at the end how it stopped cutting? You stopped hearing that sharp cutting sound, that it just was gliding. That's because the depth stop kicked in. It will hit the depth stop at the beginning of the board, so it'll stop cutting here, and as you work your way back, it eventually will hit the depth stop all along the width of your board, or the length of your board, and then you've got a nice clean groove. Let me show you what happened here. As you can see, we have our nice clean groove. This is the one thing that a 45 works really well at. cutting across the grain, not so much any kind of shape, you know, bead, hollow, round, that kind of thing. Window muntin, unless you've got really straight grained wood and you take very light cuts, it's not going to do the greatest job. But I thought this might be interesting. It's an interesting piece of woodworking history for those who might not be familiar with the 45 and the 55. If you found this interesting, let me know in the comments below. Thanks, and keep safe, everybody.